For the technical difficulties. My name is Irina Zodro. I head the Partnerships and Stakeholder Engagement Unit at UNDR, where I'm, among others, responsible for our engagement with the private sector. So it's a real pleasure to welcome you all to today's event on supporting disaster risk reduction and resilience practices in small and medium enterprises. The webinar is organized by UNDR and members of our private sector network ARISE, and it supports the UK-led Race to Resilience. So we have all known for a long time that SMEs are particularly vulnerable to disasters and at the same time critical for the broader resilience of the communities they work in. However, despite proven benefits of greater investment into risk reduction, SMEs are still often left alone in the struggle for resilience. So in this webinar, we will discuss opportunities to support increased disaster risk reduction and resilience in and for SMEs, focusing on supporting policy frameworks that address the specific needs of SMEs, providing access to finance and financial products that are tailored to SMEs, addressing interdependency and inequities across the supply chain, including through contracting models, and combining enterprise risk management and business continuity plans to increase focus on risk prevention through enhanced accessibility, awareness raising, and incentives. Just to highlight, these topics align with the findings of a new UNDR report on increasing SME uptake of DRR, which is guidance for policymakers, financiers, and large businesses. We are sharing this, the summary slide deck in the chat. The full report will be accessible on our UNDI website on Monday. So we've been fortunate to secure a great lineup of thought leaders in this area and look forward to hearing their insights. Before we go into the substance, just a couple of housekeeping items. We are recording the session and the recording will be made available after the live panel. All participants are muted by default. For today's moderated session, we will use the Q&A function. So please put any questions that you may have throughout the session into the Q&A. With this now, I would like to ask our moderator of today, Daniel Stander, Deputy Chair of the Board of the Resilient Cities Network, to take us through the session. Just before Daniel takes up, we'll play a very short video, which I hope will put us right into the topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Irina. As she rightly said, this is a very important issue. We know that small and medium-sized enterprises are critical to the global economy. They produce more than 50% of the world's GDP. They employ 2 out of every 3 people. Resilience of the SME sector is essential. I'm very pleased to be joined by 3 esteemed colleagues to kick off this conversation. First, we have Mami Mitsutori, who I'm sure you know is the United Nations Special Representative of the Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction. We also have Mr. Saber Chowdhury. He's the chairman of the Parliamentary Committee of the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change in the Parliament of Bangladesh. And I'm also pleased to be joined by Hans-Peter Teufers, who is both the head of international programs at the UPS Foundation, as well as the co-chair of the Arise Network. Thank you very much for joining me today. Mami, could I begin with you first, please? You and I have both just returned from Glasgow from the COP. Perhaps you could give us your broad impressions, first of returning from the COP, but specifically with this topic in mind.
So thank you very much, Daniel. Yes, I was at COP this week, and UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction went with call of action in 3 critical areas. And one is that there is a strong need to raise ambition in financing for adaptation. And for this to become a reality, that we need to make reality the $100 billion annual contribution support to developing countries with a 50-50 share of mitigation and adaptation. The second call was to enhance drastically support to developing countries, both in financial terms and also in technical capacity support for their loss and damage issue. And this means to support them to have better loss and damage databases, and also to enhance access to risk management tools. And the third was to make more accessible, predictable risk financing available for disaster risk reduction and climate adaptation as well. Now, I felt that now, after several years, the issue of adaptation and disaster risk reduction has become an integral part of COP. And we're not surprised, because this is because while we struggle to mitigate, and that is crucially necessary in order to save our planet and save humanity, the impact of disasters are becoming stronger and stronger. This is seen in all countries, including Europe, like this summer, but particularly the least developed countries, the small island developing states, the landlocked developing countries, they are hit immensely by these disasters, and we need to tackle this now urgently. And this is really connected to what we're going to talk about today about SMEs, because as we have heard from you, Daniel, they constitute a very important part of the economy. And at the same time, they are what we call belonging to the vulnerable groups. We just saw that video, right, which was very clear in how vulnerable SMEs are when disaster strikes, and the fact that it's very difficult for a lot of them to bounce back. So today's discussion is very important. I'm delighted to share this panel with a great friend of DRR, of UNDRR, Honorable Saber Chowdhury, and also with Hans-Peter, who co-chairs the Arise Network, Arise Global Board, along with me. And as Irina said, we have been making SMEs a focus of our work in terms of working and supporting our stakeholders. We have had we had a report come out already about looking at the status of SMEs, reducing risk and building resilience of SMEs to disaster. And we are very shortly going to, as Irina mentioned, bring out another report which now talks about the solutions, because this is important. And at the COP2, I saw many solutions on the table, using innovative tools, using innovative financial tools. And we do need to talk about the solutions. And therefore, I am also very encouraged with this webinar, which is going to feature our friends and colleagues from different regions, different perspectives, because we can't bring SMEs in one big group, right? There are different challenges depending on which region they are in, which sector they are operating in. So I'm hoping that with today's webinar, we will listen to many of the, not only the challenges, but also solutions in what we need to do. So I will stop there and hand it over to you back, Daniel.
Thank you, Mami.
Thank you, Mami.
I too was very heartened by the big theme coming out of COP this year, which was rebalancing on the agenda, not just mitigation, but the race to resilience, not just the race to net zero, but the race to resilience. And I think that's been long overdue. We still have much more work to be done. Saber, if I could turn to you, please, because I think you are still in Glasgow. I presume you too are welcoming this shift in the agenda. Of course, mitigation is extremely important, especially representing a country which is not a large emitter, but yet which is nonetheless a country that is particularly vulnerable to climate change. But I hope also important that we begin to bring the resilience agenda up in the global dialogue. Interested in your perspectives generally coming out of COP, if you could share those, please.
Yes, I'm still in Glasgow, and you can probably hear a lot of background noise because we are trying to go to the end and have a successful resolution. There is still a lot of work to be done. In fact, I will be leaving this session to join a meeting on long-term financing, because I'm representing the LDC Ministerial Committee there. I think there is greater awareness, Daniel, as you have talked about. And of course, resilience is featuring more and more. I think it is the convergence of the disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation agendas. And I think people are catching up to it more and more as we go along. And of course, resilience, how we define it, is equally important. It is not just responding to shocks and being able to absorb shocks, but it also to prepare yourself to a higher level of resilience, so you are able to withstand the future shocks. I think, so resilience is a dynamic process. And when we talk about race to resilience, there isn't a finishing line because it is a continual process. And because of the way temperature increases are impacting the climate system, we know that we are in for the long haul rather than a 100-meter sprint. So resilience is going to be absolutely critical. Whatever actions, whatever success we are able to generate during the course of COP26 over the next 24 hours, they will take time to have impact in the real world. And at that time also, the resilience is going to come more and more into play. So I'm fully in sync with what Mami was saying earlier. And I think the focus on SMEs, I see SMEs as a very strategic entry point into the whole of society, whole of government approach. Because SMEs are, they're embedded in local communities. They're small enterprises. It's not the large IT organizations in high buildings or skyscrapers. So they're much more closer to the ground, literally. And because of the fact that they are embedded in local communities, I think if we can get them to be more aware of risk reduction, because I think at the moment they are focused more on the traditional approach to risk, which is on recovery. So if we can get them more sensitized on being sensitive to risk reduction, how do we manage risk, how do we forward plan, and of course they are also constrained. SME doesn't have the same human, financial, or IT tools. A large corporation will look at AI, they will look at Internet of Things, they will look at blockchain. They also don't have the human resources. I think that understanding of the financing tools and the options, where are the insurance possibilities. So I think that awareness building is perhaps going to be the first stage, which is absolutely critical. And then, of course, we as parliamentarians and, of course, the government comes in terms of the policy regime. How can we create first an enabling environment for the SMEs to flourish? I think that's very, very important. Giving them a seat at the table. making our policy articulation processes more inclusive, targeting specific legislation, then looking at the budget. What can we do in the budget, especially to help the SMEs? And I think the SMEs are also in a way disadvantaged or marginalized because they don't have the lobbying, or the advocacy reach that the larger corporations have. So as you pointed out, Daniel, and as Mami was talking, if we look at their footprint in terms of employment generation, if we look at their footprint in terms of their contribution to GDP, it is immense. And I think it is high time that we factor that in and give them the priority and focus that is so badly needed and that they deserve.
Thank you, Saber. Very well said. And they don't just make a big difference to the economy, they make a massive difference to the local communities also that they serve. I was very pleased to hear you make eloquently the point that we need to shift the view from ex post emergency response planning to ex ante disaster risk preparedness. But I also think that there's an important point you made about the virtuous circle there, that this is we need to embrace this with a spirit of continuous improvement. It is not a sprint, it is a marathon, but I sense also the urgency that it might be a marathon at the speed of a sprint, that we need to keep up that pace. Hans-Peter, if I could turn to you, please. Is your role as co-chair of the Arise Network, I know that the SMEs in this world, they don't capture the headlines. They're not Fortune 100, 500, 1,000 companies. How does the Arise Network embrace the small and medium-sized enterprises? Do you have them as your members, or do you work more indirectly through them? I'd love to hear more about the work that Arise is doing in this space, given the particular vulnerability and importance of the SME sector, please.
Daniel, thanks a lot. Appreciate to be part of this discussion, because I think that that SMEs indeed are extremely relevant for the communities, and I'm happy to give a few indications on SMEs within and with Arise. And I would like to raise as well one point from my personal experience. As you might know, or as you said, I'm dealing with international projects and programs for the UPS Foundation. We have some experience, especially with SMEs, so that might help as well to get a little bit of an understanding. The point here is, let's talk about Arise and what we can do, because that's the major point, right? So I think that the situation around SMEs and that they are the most vulnerable is quite clear to most of the people and most of the politicians as well. And I appreciate what Saber said, that awareness raising is one of the major topics here. That's really relevant. Another major topic, of course, especially from the political side, is that we do know from surveys that SMEs in this last crisis, the recent one that we had with COVID, 50% of them were more or less asking, if asked for, what type of support do you need? They say financial, because they were suffering, as most of the products they were dealing with, the services they were dealing with, were not requested, were not demanded. So, and financial, that's something that where usually the states have to weigh in. This is more or less a political decision. So usually the private sector has its limitations to deal with it. On the other side, if being asked what is Arise doing and what the private sector can do, there is a lot we can do. There's a lot we can do, and we are doing it. Small and medium-sized enterprises is one of the 4 pillars that Arise has as key performance indicators. So the goals that we have set for the networks, we have about 30 networks, around 30 networks worldwide, and the goals where we are currently which we are reviewing currently to make them sharper as an instrument, are focusing on SMEs a lot. This is one of the major goals, and I can tell you we have just done a survey which brought incredible results, that about 9 out of 10 participants are already engaging in long-term resilience programs for small and medium-sized enterprises. And so we are right on track with what we wanted to achieve with that in the networks. And the top 3 activities that the networks are describing to be in the core of their activities is to develop DRR and resilience webinars, and to work with key institutions of the public sector, and to engage as well with industry leaders. This is by the way, relevant because SMEs are as well members. We have SMEs as members in our networks. It's a mix of bigger companies and smaller companies, small and medium-sized enterprises. So therefore, there is a discussion within the networks, and we want to strengthen that as well to make sure that we have a better understanding what the needs are. Especially the survey that we did this year was very helpful to understand better what the networks need in order to get the right support for their work in having small and medium-sized enterprise even in a better stage of resilience. Now, what concrete can be done? I mean, some of the examples I mentioned, webinars and so forth, what has been done. But fact is that every company in the private sector can think about what the small and medium-sized enterprise means to them. In most of the cases, it will be one of the bigger client groups. You mentioned 2 or 3 workplaces are that's one figure. But if you dive deeper into that, you'll see easily that more than 90% of the GDP usually is done on. And of the companies are small and medium-sized enterprises, and at least 3/3, 3/4 of the GDP is coming from small and medium-sized enterprises, and especially in the community area, small and medium-sized enterprises even play a bigger role. So we all have heard that when a big company is losing market share and going down a little bit, have to lower the workforce in a certain area, a city is suffering a lot. So usually, if that is happening, then small and medium-sized enterprises are covering that gap. They are producing more workplaces in case bigger ones are losing. So they play an eminent role in the communities. And what corporations can do is trying to look into their supply chains and into value chains and make sure that they are playing on the rules. Making sure that they have the right view as well on their suppliers and the supply chains, but as well demanding, for instance, making sure that SMEs are following rules related to business continuity. And let me tell you one thing that is really relevant, I think, what especially private sector and as well maybe politics have to take into account, because it goes into the awareness area. I'm a big fan of the 80-20 or so-called 80-20 principle, Pareto principle, right? Which means that 20% with 20% of input, you can solve 80% of the problems, so that you have a lot of energy available, 80%, to solve the remaining ones. So if you take that into account, then awareness building is already a good key for increasing resilience, as the more awareness is created among small and medium-sized enterprises where the gaps are, what they need to do, what they have to do. If they are simply doing 5 things, for instance, in order to reduce their vulnerability, and I'm talking about simple things. I'm talking about, for instance, about data security, data resilience as well, creating redundancy. So those type of things that maybe in bigger corporations is very normal. That is already a good step on the path to more resilience, where small and medium-sized enterprises can have an advantage if they simply follow some of those rules. One other point is scaling. If these type of resilience training should be scaled, then it needs to be done in collaboration, and that's really one of the big advantages that networks like Arise have, that there is an exchange of knowledge. There is as well a very good platform that UNDRR provides with the Prevention Web, where a lot of knowledge can be shared, is shared as well amongst participants, so that at the end of the day, The collaborative efforts are very valuable to improve and to increase, to scale resilience amongst SMEs. We just have to make sure that we understand each other well, and that we are going together. We are creating this type of collaboration within networks that is then following some of the goals that we have laid out. So that's probably in a nutshell what I would like to say when being asked what a RISE is able to do, and especially what the private sector can do. And I'm sure that from the networks, from Michael and Lizra and others, we will hear and learn more what they are doing locally. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Hans-Peter. What can I say? That was very, very dense. There was a lot there, and your nutshells are bigger than most. So before I go and bring Mami back in to respond, I know we have Laura Ballesteros here with us, and I'm not sure she's able to be with us for the duration, so I'd like to bring her into the conversation early. Laura, thank you very much. And for those that don't know, Laura is the Secretary for Sustainable Urban Development at the city of Monterrey in Mexico, and she was with us in COP with her mayor. Laura, I am very committed to urban resilience, not least in my role as deputy chair of the Resilient Cities Network. I wondered whether you could speak a little bit to the importance of SMEs to urban resilience. Hans-Peter mentioned that, but also what it is we need to do. What would your call to action be, whether it be from financiers to make financing available, whether it be to policymakers, maybe even to the UN system? So please enlighten us on the importance of SMEs to your city, but also what you need from the global community to increase SME resilience and thereby urban resilience in Monterrey.
Of course, Daniel, and thank you very much for this invitation. Mayor says hi. He's working very hard since we got here yesterday, and I am very glad, I'm very pleased to be here with you to share the work that we are doing since a month ago. This is a very young government. We just started, and you have also to know that we have a very young mayor. He's 36 years old. So he's very committed with all the resiliency agenda and of course with the climate action that everybody has to be committed in these moments of our planet. So speaking about the importance of resilience in SMEs, I have to say that we are very focused in three main points. But first of all, it is important for you to know that 90% of the business that we have here in Mexico, they're part of SMEs environment and also of the medium and the small enterprises. So for us, they are the heart of the economic development inside Monterrey. And that is the reason why they are so key for the development of the city. And also it is important to know that we face a lot of challenges, just as I know many countries do and cities do, when it comes about the lifelong lasting of these enterprises. The life of these enterprises, it is just 5 years. So one of our biggest challenges is how we can be with them in terms of how they can last longer and have more interaction with the environment for a longer time. So for us, we are focused, as I said, in three main points. The first one, it is related into the capacity building. And it is very important to understand that we have a policy that it is centered into the person. So each company, it is important because it allows to the citizens to be better when it comes about work and the capacity building assessments. So we're focused on that in this moment. The second key point here is the infrastructure. For us, also very important to provide them from some infrastructure. It's not just about the internet. It is also about how they can have a proper environment to work and when also the assessments can be provided. So we are working in those specific hubs to make this happen. And the third one is how we can join them in their entrepreneurship with urban policies. But because we have to understand that the green infrastructure and all the work that the government, the city government can provide for them is also key. So we are very interested also in have a perfect blend when it comes about the economic agenda and the urban infrastructure agenda. So I think that in talking about these three main points, we are, as I said, starting it because we just started a month ago in this government, but we will be very focused on this. And I think that also will be very important to understand, and I can go further on this in my next interventions, on how we can join them in their work when it comes about the resilience agenda for the health issues. So if they are prepared to face these kind of health issues, such as the COVID one, and how they can be how they can react when it comes about these matters, and how they can be reactivate their own activities once it is passed, or maybe a little more normalize it. It will also part of our job because they are very stressed in an economic way right now, as you understand, because of this crisis. So they also need to understand the importance of to be prepared on this.
Laura, thank you. Lots there to follow up on. You are at the beginning of your administrative term, and I look forward to having more engaging conversations with you in the months and years to come. I understand that you may have to leave us to get back to business, so please, thank you for your time with us. If you need to slip out, slip out. I also understand that Mr. Chowdhury, you need to get back and into the negotiating room. I wanted to give you a word before you did. Is there anything you'd like to come back on what you've heard, whether that be from Hans-Peter or from Laura, before I turn the floor back over to Mami?
No, I think we're all on the same page. And basically, what we are saying is the SME sector, whenever there's a disaster, they are hit the hardest, they suffer the longest, and they are least equipped to handle the shocks. So what is the next step? The next step is we raise awareness. We inform them to the point that they're equipped, and then they take action. I think this is what we expect from them. And from our side, the really overarching recognition is that how can we risk-proof these hugely important drivers of our economy? I think that is in everybody's interest to do. And I'm sure as Mami, and I thank her for her excellent leadership, will also agree, this is where our focus has to be more than ever before.
Mr. Chowdhury, thank you for joining us, and thank you for continuing to advance the agenda in your important role as a parliamentarian. You have an important role to play in this in the discussion. We'll leave you to get back into the negotiating room as you need. Thank you for being with us. Mami, if I can come to you, I want to try and bring the conversation really to some specific solutions. We've talked a lot about the issues facing SMEs, whether it's the lack of access to advantageous financing, whether it's the lack of infrastructure that they have at hand. It hasn't been mentioned, but it's something I see often, which is asymmetric contracts. So there's a legal element. Often SMEs suffer from having informal contracts or contracting that doesn't really look after their best interests. Given this complex landscape, what kind of specific recommendations is UNDRR putting forward, whether that be towards financiers, whether it be towards policymakers, or to the wider business community?
Thank you very much, Daniel. Indeed, we need to talk about solutions. The biggest nut to crack is how can we incentivize small and medium enterprises to focus more on prevention as opposed to responding and trying to recover? And this is the crucial question, because as we have been already talking, most SMEs cannot recover. So if they don't prevent, it's not even enough to prepare better, right? Because many times preparing can save lives, but it cannot save economic loss. So how can they prevent better? Now, several recommendations, if I may. First, we need to support and develop frameworks, political policy frameworks, both international and national, that address the specific needs of SMEs, because it's really not done. So for this, we need to have more data, disaggregated data on how SMEs and disasters interact. And those data needs to inform targeted and intersectional policy and fiscal approaches. We need to have systematic evaluations on different interventions from the government, both national and local, to establish which SME-focused policies work best in order to bring them to focus on prevention. We need to implement international policy frameworks through a very comprehensive national and local disaster risk reduction strategy, which means that the international policy frameworks needs to look at both the historic loss and damage that has been affecting SMEs, but also look at the future and current data and risks from climate and all other hazards. And then we need to engage SMEs themselves into the development of platforms, both national and multi-sector. They need to be part of establishing what policies they need to have. And we need to create peer-to-peer networks, and that's something that Arise is trying to do. And importantly, as Sadaya was mentioning, the incentives, it's very important to legalize informal businesses so that they are not kept outside any of these policies that we are talking about. Now, the second thing I would say that it's very important to provide access to finance and financial products which are specifically tailored for SMEs. And these include risk financing, these include insurance, and also, as Laura was saying, we need to bring the SMEs into the world of nature-based solutions, green infrastructure, which is becoming more and more focused and central to the DRR solutions. And when we think about insurance that I just mentioned, the insurance themselves, the pricing, the premiums need to be set in a way that they, again, incentivize SMEs to prevent better. For example, providing less expensive premiums for SMEs, which are better preventing themselves from risk. Then important thing is the third thing is combine what is the enterprise risk management and the business continuity management mechanisms. Now, many SMEs don't have business continuity plans, but even when they do have them, they are not really about prevention, nor even about preparedness. They are largely about response. That is what we have found. So these business continuity plans, BCPs, need to be combined with enterprise risk management so that they are truly focused on prevention. And the fourth and last thing I would say, which needs to be done, is to map and address interdependencies, complexities, and inequalities in supply and value chains related to disaster risk. Again, mapping is always the fundamental exercise that we need to do. And through this mapping of what is the issues in the supply chain that is affecting the SMEs, then the solutions will be found. So these are the recommendations that UNDRR is putting forward in terms of how can we build the resilience of the SMEs. Over to you, Daniel.
Thank you, Mami. Very concrete suggestions. I would like to open up the discussion a little bit more, if that's okay, and bring in some other voices. We have at least 3 other important voices that we've not heard from yet. So we're fortunate enough to be joined by Lizra Fabienne, who's the Executive Director of the Association of Industry and Commerce in Dominica. We also have Catherine Lindqvist, who's an Economic Affairs Officer at the World Trade Organization. And we also have the CEO of the Africa Business Group, Michael Sudakasa. And I wonder, Michael, if it's okay, can I begin with you? I'd be really interested in your reactions to those specific recommendations that Mami just enumerated. And bring to us the lens of African business. Because I don't want to be blind to that, and you have a unique perspective on this question of SME resilience. I'm sure it's the same insofar as SMEs contribute massively to the economy and to society, and I am sure it's the same that they are the most vulnerable. The question is, what do we need to do about it? And I'd be very interested in your perspectives from the African continent, if you could share those, please.
No, thank you very much, Daniel. And Mami and Hans really have laid out some of the things that we're trying to bring to the private sector on the continent. We just last year launched Arise Africa. I think one of the, and not from a capacity standpoint, from just exposure standpoint, big challenges is just knowledge about disaster risk reduction. So Hans talked about the importance of webinars. That's key, but when you think about the digital divide that exists on the continent as well, that's also a challenge. Many people don't have access to a laptop or even a smartphone. So, we've really been hurt in this period of COVID when we can't gather. The informality of business is key. 80% of the businesses on the continent are SMEs. So most people, I'll also say time is a challenge. So some might think it a luxury to plan for disaster when I'm just trying to make sure that I have enough at the end of this day to feed my family, pay my staff, etc. We have huge challenges with power. So the whole digital development is constrained when 600 million of the 1.2 billion Africans don't have access to electricity. So we're starting with trying to make sure that people first become aware of the concepts, business continuity planning. What does that mean tangibly? Access to finance is a critical one. Everyone, and that's been mentioned before, feel like capital is key. But unlike yourself, Daniel, and also our other colleague from Mexico, 60% of the people are in the rural areas. So, what does an SME in a rural area need to focus on? A lot of that is agriculture. So how do you focus on disaster risk reduction in an agrarian economy? Insurance becomes key, microinsurance, so that when your crops fail because of climate challenges, you actually don't go out of business. So many of the businesses on the continent, and it was mentioned by the colleagues, that got hit by COVID, basically, not having a market, they're gone. They're people had to pivot to figure out, how do I eat? And maybe they will come back. But the other challenge that we have on the continent is a COVID divide. We have, not COVID vaccine divide. Only 4% of the continent right now, as the world starts cranking back up and getting about engaging, have access to the vaccine. And it's only projected that it's really 2023 that we will start having 70-80% of the continent having that access. And as there are barriers that are being put in place to keep the unvaccinated away from the vaccinated parts of the world, that's going to further impact the economies on the continent. So we're trying to grapple with that, but definitely information dissemination is key. Insurance promotion is key. Talking where you can about business continuity planning and the tools. We're trying to work with our colleagues in other parts of the Arise global community who have experience in this, where to borrow some of their good practices and present them on the continent. So I guess the only thing I can say is that small business on the continent is also used to working with less. So there's resilience kind of built into the nature of being in enterprise on the continent. But it's definitely an uphill battle that we're running against. And we're happy to be able to bring all of the tools, Relief Web, et cetera, that are part of the toolkit that Arise has to the African continent. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Michael. I thought there were some really profound comments there. Thank you at the end for grounding the fact that actually resilience comes from within. There is a personal resilience that we are all bringing to the table every day that we wake up. And thank you also for foregrounding not just climate injustice, but I'm going to call it infrastructure injustice, the lack of universal access to basic infrastructure. The other thing, I'm, as a self-confessed insurance geek, I'm really pleased to hear you mention insurance. You called it micro-insurance. I like to call it inclusive insurance. Extremely important to get this kind of financing available to out into the rural areas. And personally, I think that risk financing goes hand in glove with disaster risk reduction as the two most impactful forms of ex-ante protection, these things we do in advance. I wondered though, Lizra, if I could bring you into the conversation, please. We heard from Laura. She talked about being a young government, and she is clearly young and young in the role. I'm struck by the fact that I'm probably the oldest person on this call, and I have some very youthful faces and voices around me. I'd love to hear from you both from a Caribbean perspective, if you felt that you could share that. And if you felt comfortable talking to it, what do we think the role is of youth in this overarching agenda around SME resilience? If you had some words to share on that, or in due course, Catherine, when we come to you, because you also have a very youthful face, and I'm sure you would have some perspectives on that. But Lizra, to you in the first instance, please.
Great. Thank you so much for having me as part of this panel. It's a pleasure to share more about the Caribbean, because similar to the businesses and how Michael described the business community in Africa, we see some similarities in the Caribbean. So most of our businesses are SMEs, and many businesses are informal. The businesses contribute to 90% of our economy in Dominica, and also in the Caribbean. We see that same trend across the Caribbean. We also see that many businesses are prone to disaster. And I know when we speak about disaster in the UNDRR, the UN space, sometimes we say it's based on the actions that persons have taken. And in some cases, it's based on the pattern of behavior. But some are other risks that they're generally faced with. So we've seen businesses are really prone to disasters in some sense, and some are focused a lot on recovery as opposed to prevention, which was mentioned by Mami. But now we are seeing in the Caribbean, based on what we've been faced with Hurricane Maria, Hurricane Irma, Dorian, that also devastated the Bahamas, that businesses are being more conscious of moving to prevention rather than just recovery. So with our businesses, we've seen a number of actions being taken. We're focusing more on business continuity planning. And as Mami mentioned too, it's not just the BCP part of it, but enterprise risk management. That's a conversation that I had this morning with our CARICHAM chair as to how we can actually more tangibly look at integrated enterprise risk management for our businesses within the Caribbean. So the conversations are being had and actions are being taken to focus a bit more on that and securing the resources to make sure that we can position our businesses to not just look at responding, but also look at preventing and ensuring the entire business is really prepared to prevent as opposed to recover. You mentioned about young persons and looking at our SME sector, well, SMEs across the region, we're seeing that many of our SMEs are actually young people who have pivoted from being affected by even COVID to open up their own business. We see a lot more businesses looking at digital technologies about meeting the needs of consumers across the world. So not just looking at solving problems within our Caribbean space, but also connecting to customers worldwide. And in terms of our young persons, they are getting more conscious, are getting more motivated. We even see new organizations coming up. So there's an organization called Caridima, which was set up by UNESCO, which brings together young professionals in the Caribbean to help support their own countries and increase that sensitization of disaster risk. I know it was also mentioned in a number of areas. Mami mentioned the critical success factors. We hosted an event at our regional platform side event that looked at SME resilience, similar topic that we're discussing here, and some key points came through, but also looking at the interdependencies within the supply chain and how bigger businesses have a role to support the younger or the smaller businesses to ensure that they're not just looking out for their profit, but they're ensuring that the entire value chain is resilient as we continue to build. And as we mentioned resilience, achieving a certain state at one point doesn't mean that it's continued. So we are always in that state, having to seek to be more resilient because we're affected like by new things like COVID, and we don't want to always have to respond to the challenges that we face. So looking at how we bring these conversations to everyone, ensuring that the minute or the smallest business understand how they could be affected and actually put measures in place to prevent, but also not just build back better, but build better before.
Thank you, Lizra. Very eloquently spoken. And you, at the end there, began to surface exactly where I wanted to go next, because small island developing states face their own unique challenges from climate change, of course, but also island states often sit at a crossroads of trade and of international business. And you began talking about supply chains, distribution networks, and global value chains. And I know Hans-Peter will, from his years at UPS, know the importance of those value chains. I wondered if we could pick up on that topic with you, Catherine, if you felt comfortable. Because for me, SME resilience, understanding the role of their relationships with their suppliers and their distributors is essential. And unlike Fortune 1000 companies, they don't have robust supply chains with lots of redundancy baked in, which makes them even more vulnerable. But you, from your perspective, which I know is a global one from WTO, what are your thoughts just generally on the topic of SME resilience? And if you felt comfortable talking about either picking up on the question of youth or picking up on the question of supply chains and interrelationships between business, I'd love to hear your perspectives.
Sure. Thank you very much, Daniel. And thank you, everyone, for having me here today to speak on behalf of the World Trade Organization. In fact, I'm really representing the WTO MISME, or Micro, Small, and Medium-Sized Enterprise Informal Working Group. And this is a group of 91 members of the WTO who come together to discuss MISME-related trade issues. And resilience at this point is a key one. The group has issued a statement and also working on a ministerial document that cites COVID-19 and the need for collaboration among nations together to really focus on these businesses, given that they are such a crucial part of the economy. This has already been mentioned, just the sheer number of MISMEs that there are. They're the key part of every economy, and it doesn't matter where. And in fact, listening to the conversation, it was interesting as well, hearing from our colleague in South Africa. He cited that I think there's 80% of businesses there are MISMEs, but in fact, I suspect this is higher. On average in the world, it's above 90%, and there's an issue, especially in Africa, of informal businesses, which again, coming to resilience, this is even more challenging when you don't have access to the formal banking sector, et cetera, in order to access finance. Regarding value chains, this is where it gets tricky with trade and disaster recovery. On the one hand, trade is essential for recovering from a disaster. When your own economy has been devastated, you need resources from abroad to come in and assist. And we've even seen in COVID just the importance of trade in terms of access to vaccines and creating them and getting them where they need to be. But on the flip side, it can also be a vector for transmitting challenges. And as mentioned, MISMEs generally have, I'm going to take a step back. MISMEs can be a critical part of value chains. They supply parts and services that are needed in order for final production. And if they close their doors, if they cannot continue, this affects the entire output of a global value chain, or can. But ensuring that they can continue their business is not always obvious. The ways the things that need to take place, and in terms of trade, ensuring that they have access to the inputs that they need is challenging because they don't necessarily have backup suppliers. And I think this is where prevention comes in, as Mami cited earlier. This is really where the focus needs to be. If we're going to prevent future disaster, future adverse outcomes from disasters as much as possible. One of the critical areas that we need to focus on is having backups and making sure that trade is put in place in such a way that it can support businesses to continue on and move forward. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. I'm seeing a question in the chat which I want to come to. But before I do, Mami, I wondered if you could just ground this conversation a little bit more in the Sendai framework for me. And I tell you why I say that. We heard from Lizra, she referenced the storms of 2017. You referenced Irma and Maria. And I think that's important. And in this week of COP and of climate action, it's important to think about our floods and our hurricanes and our wildfires and all of the other climatological shocks and stresses that can impact SMEs. But it's not just the climatological. So I wondered if you could just broaden it for me and just for those who may not know, explain or enumerate the breadth of the Sendai framework and all of the shocks and stresses that we at UNDRR are thinking about here.
Thank you, Daniel, for that important question. So indeed, the Sendai framework covers, to start with, hazards, a wide range of hazards, right? We talk about in the Sendai framework both natural and man-made hazards and related biological, chemical, environmental hazards. So what does this mean? It means that, of course, climate emergency. And we know that currently 90% of major disasters are in some way big or large or small related to climate emergencies. So yes, we focus on natural hazards. But in natural hazards alone, we have other hazards such as geophysical hazards, earthquakes, tsunamis. And when we talk about man-made hazards, we're talking about large industrial accidents, such as the one that we saw in Beirut last summer at the port of Beirut. When we talk about environmental hazards, we're talking about pollution. And when we talk about biological hazards, there we go, we're talking about COVID, right? Because, pandemic, epidemics, these are the types of disasters that were foreseen to be the big issues that will impact on all of us, but especially now, talking about SMEs, we haven't counted yet, but how many small and medium and micro businesses have gone away because of COVID, which is a biological hazard-induced disaster. So we do need to think about it. And in that aspect, recently, the UNDRR, together with the International Science Council, we worked with academics and we looked into, so what is the list of hazards that are in this broad range that I mentioned, and we came up with 300 plus hazards. So that's quite a daunting number. And here it's important that the SMEs are guided so that they first understand what are the hazards that they are exposed to. But more to that, and Daniel tried to answer your question better, it's not only about hazards, right? It's also about the exposure and the vulnerability, and the capacity. These are the four things that makes a hazard into a disaster. Because if a hazard just sweeps through, if it's a storm, a place where nobody lives, if there's no SME, then that's not a disaster, right? But when it is combined with, let's say in the case of SME, an SME which has an asset which is built on a hazard-prone area, a vulnerable area, flood-prone, but is not moving out, and then the capacity of the SME itself to analyze its own risks and prevent from them becoming a disaster is very low. That is where it becomes a disaster. And the Sendai framework is essentially a framework to say we need to mitigate all this, the hazard, the exposure, the vulnerability, so that again the hazard doesn't become a disaster. And the other important thing about the Sendai framework is that it says that this is about whole of business, whole of society business. This is whole of society, so approach must also be whole of society. And that's where it's very important, as we are doing in this webinar, that we are talking about SMEs with the business people, the chambers of commerce, the World Trade Organization, but also with mayors and also with parliamentarians such as Mr. Chaudhry Samair, because we need to have these legal frameworks that allow policies for supporting SMEs to be legally based, which is the basis for good risk governance. So that is broadly what the Sendai framework is saying. And it also says that it doesn't say yet leave no one behind, because actually Sendai framework was the first of the 2030 agenda that was agreed on. And later the leave no one behind word became a very, very strong focus of all the agenda items. But what I want to say is that the essence is already there, because Sendai framework is a people-centered framework about disaster risk reduction, looking into human rights. So that's where leave no one behind comes from. And in the case of industry, in the case of private sector, SMEs are the ones that can be left behind very quickly, although they are the vast majority of any economy. And that's why today's discussion is very important. Over to you.
Thanks, Mami. Really important to ground the full breadth of shocks and stresses, because and it helps us understand, I think, the challenge that we're facing here, and that any policies that we drive through need to be responsive to all those different shocks and stresses, as well as being people-centered and focused on the needs of the SMEs. There was a very interesting question in the chat. I am going to try and answer it, even though I'm just the moderator. But if anybody else would like to offer an answer, please catch my eye, and I'll gladly bring you in.
Yes, I would like to after you. You go through.
That was from you, Lizra?
Yes.
Well, I tell you what, because I'm just the moderator and you're actually the panelist, why don't you go first? I'm interested to see what you're going to be talking about, and whether you're going to be talking about CRIF or other things that are happening in the Caribbean. But why don't you share your perspectives on essentially how we fill the, as the questioner puts it, the catastrophe liquidity gap for SMEs, and is parametric insurance a potential solution there? I'd love to hear what you have to say on that, please.
So that was actually one of the points that I wanted to bring forth, and I'm happy that the question came through. So one of the initiatives that took place in Dominica recently, that's actually this year, it's not CRIF, but it's actually a parametric hurricane facility that looked at supporting the fisherfolk and the the farmers in Dominica. And it was led by CREED, which is our Climate Resilience Execution Agency of Dominica, together with the Cooperative Societies League. So there was a merger or partnership between these two organizations that looked at helping the SME sector and helping small businesses as well as individuals in Dominica take on parametric insurance as one of the solutions to have increased liquidity in case of a catastrophe. So if the person wants more information, for sure, they could be connected so that we could go more in detail with it. But it's something that has been piloted in Dominica, and I believe that it's actually really great for strengthening the liquidity of our SME sector.
Well, I'll tell you what, Lizra, I'd like to hear more about it. I know a little bit about it already. So you referenced CREED, which, if my acronyms are good, is the Climate Resilience Execution Agency for Dominica, if I remember that correctly.
Yes, yes, that's correct.
And just for the benefit of the questioner, I would just say there's actually a tremendous amount going on in this space, and I'm just going to name check a few things. And if anybody else wants to come in, please do so. The FSD Africa, Financial Sector Deepening Africa, is doing a lot of work on parametric insurance in Africa, in urban areas and in rural areas. The United Nations Development Programme recently stood up a new initiative called the Insurance and Risk Financing Facility, and one of the thematic pillars of that work is inclusive insurance, and that's a global regional program. There's a lot that's being done by the Africa Risk Capacity in Africa, obviously. The questioner asked about new technologies and specifically mentioned blockchain. There was a volcano bond that came to market last year and is going through renewal now. And that was particularly interesting precisely because it used blockchain technology in the settlement. And there are several other interesting initiatives that are focused on not just lives, but livelihoods, and specifically the livelihoods of small, medium, and micro institutions. So I would gladly take that question offline with anybody else who wished to discuss it. Assuming no one has anything else to contribute on the matter of parametric insurance, I wondered if we could think about perhaps bringing the conversation to close. And I'd love to hear from each of you in turn with perhaps some parting words. And Hans-Peter, do you mind if I come to you next? There are several things in the conversation since you last spoke that you may wish to pick up on. I was thinking particularly about international trade and about supply chains, given your historical experience. And I'd be interested also in your point of view on access to financing, which is critical, as we heard from the questioner there, for SME resilience. But generally speaking, Hans-Peter, anything in particular that has struck you from this conversation that you feel you would like to highlight as we close?
Well, that's a good question. That's a good question, Danny. I mean, there are a couple of things that I would like to go into that, but then this is not a small intervention, but it takes a bit longer and we have to extend the webinar. So therefore, let me just
well, let me say, Hans-Peter, feel free. Feel free. So if there are things you want to share, we're not under time pressure. So please do at least telegraph some topics. And if we don't get through them all now, then that's food for thought.
Let me just focus on one thing outside your question on trade and financing. The webinar, I was just searching for the best intro. So the webinar is called The Race to Resilience, right? Well, the thing here is there is no race to resilience. That's one of the big problems, probably, because I can't see that resilience especially for small and medium-sized enterprise, that there is some type of a behavioral change, because that's what we usually would need. A behavioral change where being resilient as an SME would be one of the, let's say, most desired and most welcomed behaviors. I don't think that we have that yet. If I'm just taking one of my experiences from one of the projects that we are doing, for instance, in Turkey, since a few years, we are discussing the resilience, or let's say, at least the preparedness for one of a major disaster that could come up, because Istanbul is sitting on one of the most vulnerable plates, or let's say the connection between two plates, and the big earthquake can happen any day, right? So of course there are other cities like San Francisco and so forth who are vulnerable in this regard as well, but there was no real discussion about how to prepare for that, how to build resilience in the past years. We had a lot of efforts, but it is like trying to sell insurances to people that are probably not interested in thinking about that, what is happening maybe in 20 years from now or never. So that's one thing about resilience. And that is one of the reasons why I said awareness building is one of the most relevant pieces in that regard. And that's one of the roles that we have in the private sector, to make sure that people understand that we are not accepting, to a certain extent, as probably part, or let's say dominant partner in an international value chain, that we are not accepting that people are simply not doing something, right? At least something. That is one of the roles that bigger corporations as well have. I mean, we don't want to have more regulation or whatsoever. It's simply that we need to keep up that level of of acknowledgement of good, let's say, of good behavior, and the probably as well, let's say, distancing from bad behavior. That's very relevant. Otherwise, we won't be able to create this type of a behavioral change towards resilience, which of course is critical for small and medium-sized enterprises. And believe me, I fully understand that a small enterprise really has a lot of efforts to do in order to make their daily living. No doubt about that. No doubt about that. But this behavioral change is possible. We have seen that as well in one of the other projects that we are having in Turkey, again, with Saglam Kobi, a small and medium-sized project that is based on our generic efforts that is called Resilience in the Box. We have rolled that out a couple of years ago. And to be honest, the most successful period right now to reach small and medium-sized enterprises was in COVID times. And even though we knew that about, let's say, 50 or even more than 50% of the SMEs, when being asked what you need, is called, well, dollars, money, because we are not we are suffering due to the crisis. There are a couple of different opportunities that they could pick up on. For instance, like working on digitalization, trying to strengthen as well exporting. And I'm not talking about, international exporting in that regard. I'm talking about extending their supply chain and their value chain to neighboring countries, to neighboring communities, trying to build networks and making sure that they are not completely relying on one little bucket that is standing directly in front of their door. And that in a lot of cases is probably already a solution. So that might as well help in understanding what I'm thinking about international trade. I mean, it is if international trade and resilience, what we can do as international organizations and international companies, corporations, is to make sure that we have this type of, let's say, behavior, that we are carrying this type of behavior to our international partners as well, and making sure that we are not making differences by countries. So this type of resilience needs to be taking place in Asia as well as in Europe and in other places. Being stable as a stable partner, as an international corporation, I think is very relevant, so that we are able to set the rules rather than running after and running behind. We need to be the stable partner if in case we are able to play that role. And last but not least, the access to financing. Mark, I mentioned that already a bit earlier. A big problem, of course, of financing is for corporations that are not in the financing business is that we are probably not the ones that are able to finance in case SMEs are not successful in surviving a disaster. That's something the role of probably the local or the regional state, respectively, whatever type of unit, state, region, and so forth, has to play in support SMEs, because the scale of a disaster, of a major disaster, is too big for corporations. It's so massive. I'm just thinking about one of the major disasters where an earthquake or whatsoever is hitting a certain region. You have 10,000s of companies that are affected. That's not easy for a corporation to deal with that. Especially as corporations tend to be more and more asset light, and that means that you have more relationships rather than a big foot in the door. However, of course, corporations can support that, can support in case of a disaster, and no doubt about that. We have done that many times. Was just talking with colleagues about the Henan flooding in China, where we have a major operation, and of course UPS went in there and helped the communities. But that's the community level. In general, if we're talking about a big group of small and medium-sized enterprises, helping them to survive for many days, weeks, and months, that's probably not a role that the private sector can play. We can only support in that regard. And I pause here. Thanks.
Hans-Peter, thanks a lot for that. And I was very pleased to hear you bring up something that had been absent from the conversation up until now, which was behavioural change. And I think UNDRR is doing some great work driving thinking around interventions, but we also need a theory of change that understands humans and human behaviour in order to make sure that any recommendations are indeed picked up. I'm fortunate enough to have seen an advanced copy of the report that UNDRR will be putting out next week, if I'm not mistaken. The actions fall into 4 areas: access to finance, the development of resilient business models, more efficient and fairer contracts, and also uptake of business continuity planning that focuses more on ex-ante rather than ex-post responses. I think those recommendations will be welcome when they come out, and I think they're very nicely segmented into those 4 areas. The work was done by a firm called Vivid Economics, and I think it really is an excellent report. But I think what you say, Hans-Peter, about behavioural change and therefore needing a theory of change to drive through those areas of action is going to be essential. As we think about closing, I wondered if, Catherine, I could come to you first. Do you have a perspective perhaps on the behavioural change that is required and how we drive through more resilient practices, business models, contracts and finance? Or is there something else you wanted to leave us with?
Well, I think I'll first address that question, and in order to drive this forward, I think really, as Hans-Peter was mentioning, it's beyond businesses, and it's something that really needs to be taken up at a policy level in terms of cooperation and coordination, and that's where somewhere like the World Trade Organization can come in as a place where policymakers can come together and really look to cooperate and try to find solutions that are broader than just one location and one locality. I did want to mention just that in terms of having policymakers be aware of the problems, I would encourage anyone who would like to get in touch with the SME Informal Working Group to bring these sorts of issues to the attention of the members of this group, issues including insurance or access to trade finance, although that one is very well understood by the group. And in fact, a recent Asian Development Bank report noted that the gap in access to trade finance has increased dramatically during COVID to $1.7 trillion from $1.5 trillion. So with that, I think I will close my remarks. Thank you very much for having me, and please do be in touch. And I hope that we can really move resilience for SMEs and bring trade into the picture in a positive way for helping with future disaster recovery.
Thanks, Catherine, and thanks for foregrounding not just the important work that your organisation is doing, but the importance of global trade. Lizra, Mami's having difficulties reconnecting to the stream, which may mean that you get to have the final word. And I was wondering if there's anything you would like to leave us with. I've been impressed with your insights and with the good work that's happening in not just in your country, but the region more generally. So as we try and advance this agenda for SME resilience, I'd be grateful for any calls to action you wish to share.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity. And I do hope Mami is able to join in so she can give the final word. But I just want to also share, I didn't get to share before, that there's some key actions that we're taking in Dominica and in the Caribbean, CARICHAM specifically, where we've piloted a tool, or we've created a tool that looks at SME resilience. They would be able to complete the business continuity plan in a way that's simplified and easy for SMEs to understand. Not something that's complex and will take a number of pages, something that's really easy and tangible for the businesses. We're also training our different chambers to have the capacity to support the SMEs, because looking at SME resilience, it's not just the SME and it's not just the policyholders, but what else can we do as organizations to help strengthen that resilience? And that's why we're taking the initiative and being proactive in that. And we thank UNDRR for their support in being able to execute this. We'll also see that it's key not just focusing on BCPs, but also looking at strengthening the entire sustainability of the businesses. So we're looking at digital transformation. How can we get our businesses to understand the technologies that exist and adopt them so that they can become more resilient and survive for hundreds of years to come if we're able to live and survive that long. We're also looking at climate change. Yesterday, we had a workshop for businesses in understanding how they're affected by climate change and being able to diagnose their risk. It also looks at how we can help our businesses to understand, to manage their finances, to improve their efficiency. So it takes consciousness in a number of areas to strengthen SME resilience. And the call to action is for everyone, whoever it is, in whatever space you are, there is something that can be done to support SMEs. If you're even looking for organizations to partner with, if you have the information and you want to share that, organizations and their RISE networks are there and willing to accept and integrate your expertise in being able to strengthen the resilience of SMEs. So we call everyone to join us in being able to strengthen that resilience. Our contact information could be shared through the UNDRR as well. We'll direct attention to go to our RISE network, RISE Global Network website, where you can connect with our different chambers and see the awesome work that's being done through the RISE network. So once again, thanks for the opportunity, and we encourage everyone to take action today to help strengthen SME resilience.
Lizra, fantastic job. Thank you. Inspiring words. Mami's not been able to rejoin the stream. So Irina, I wondered if I could call on you, seeing as you set up and opened the discussion. May I turn the floor to you to close it, hoping that you're there and can come in here.
I'm still here. Unfortunately, I cannot, I can still not show my face, but sorry for that. And thank you that I now get the last words. I feel very honored. Maybe I should just say, firstly, thank you for all the participants who joined us and all our panelists. I think this discussion was extremely interesting. Also, thank you very much to you, Daniel, for managing this discussion very professionally, as usual. And from my side, just what I feel in these kind of events is it's just a huge excitement about the interest and the commitment and the opportunities to actually drive change that we have at this very moment. And it's always really, really good to see that we have partners both from the public side as well as from the private sector side. And I feel the interest and the actual engagement between, so to speak, the two groups is rising very quickly. And so maybe just to say in closing, we really look forward from the UNDR side to keep working with all of you and driving the case for long-term resilience through prevention and risk reduction. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.